Who rules the world? These days, the world is ruled by the community of countries joined by the United Nations. Some countries have more influence and power than others, but no one country rules over the rest. In the past, things were different. The most powerful country often ruled over the rest and sometimes built an empire. The ancient Egyptians did so, then the Neo-Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and later the Romans. In the 19th century and part of the 20th, the British ruled. After World War II, the world remained for a while without a global ruler. The Cold War. After World War II ended in 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union, USSR, began to compete to rule the world. There were never any direct battles between the two superpowers. However, they opposed each other in self-contained wars in several places of the world. They were also in a continuous political, commercial, and cultural struggle. This long battle for power was known as the Cold War. It lasted from shortly after the end of World War II in 1945 until 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The United States and the Soviet Union had great economic and political differences. The U.S. was a democracy, believing in personal freedom as well as in freedom in the economy and the press. The USSR was a state exclusively governed by the Communist Party. It had a planned state economy and much control over its people. The Cold War was as much a war to create an empire as an ideological war to impose beliefs on other countries. The atomic bomb. At the end of World War II, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world became aware of the deadly power of this type of bomb. Every country wanted to possess an atomic bomb, especially the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not want the United States to be the only nuclear power. Once both superpowers had nuclear bombs, they had a new problem. Either of them could use their deadly bombs against the other at any time. They had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other. This possible event was known as mutually assured destruction, MAD, and it was indeed a mad idea. How the Cold War was fought. Besides building up their military forces, both countries used other tactics to win the war. First, there were many proxy wars around the world, including wars in Greece, Korea, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. Instead of fighting each other directly, the US and the USSR used third parties to do the fighting for them. Second, there was a psychological war with speeches, movies, and books promoting the advantages of each side. Third, there were also spies working across borders to prevent unexpected actions and threats. Finally, there was the space race, in which each country tried to go further into outer space. The rest of the world. As the Cold War developed, most countries in the world took sides. Most of the countries of Western Europe and Japan aligned themselves with the U.S. The USSR aligned with many Eastern European countries which adopted a communist regime such as Poland, East Germany, Ukraine, and Czechoslovakia. The USSR also tried to get other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to align with it. Some countries in the developing world decided that they would not align with any of the superpowers. They declared themselves neutral. These countries founded the non-aligned movement. The leaders during the war. The leaders of the US and the USSR had all the power to fuel, advance, or freeze the war. The war lasted more than 40 years, and it had many leaders. In the U.S., several presidents were involved at different stages, among them Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. In the USSR, one of the main leaders was Joseph Stalin, the strongman who ruled the Soviet Union until his death in 1953. Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, and Mikhail Gorbachev were also leaders. Berlin. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones, each one controlled by one of the Allies. Later, as the Cold War began, Berlin became just 2 zones: West Berlin, controlled by the United States, France, and Great Britain, and East Berlin, controlled by the Soviet Union. Berlin thus became a symbol of the Cold War. A famous wall, the Berlin Wall, was built to prevent the citizens from East Germany escaping into the free West. The wall divided Germany and separated families. It represented the dividing line between the 2 superpowers. President Kennedy, in 1961, gave a famous speech as he visited the wall, identifying himself with Berliners wanting a free city and a free country. Freethinkers and Spies. People living in the U.S. or the USSR had to pledge their allegiance to their respective countries' ideology, no matter what they believed. There were communist thinkers in the United States who were severely condemned as potential enemies, and there were free thinkers in the Soviet Union who, because of their thoughts, were killed or sent to prison in Siberia, a cold, harsh region. Stories of spies made popular films and books. Some of them, such as the James Bond series, are still popular today. China. A few years after the beginning of the Cold War, a new actor arose: China. A revolution led by Mao Zedong imposed a communist government over China. Soon, China would also play an important role in the Cold War. Sometimes China would be allied with the Soviet Union and the Communist cause, and other times it would become friendly with the United States, particularly under President Nixon. Revolutions and rebellions. In 1959, a revolution in Cuba overthrew the dictator Batista. Soon enough, the young revolutionaries, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, declared themselves communists. The USSR began to support this new government, and other Latin American revolutionaries imitated the Cubans. The U.S. reacted to both the Communist Cuban Revolution and the spread of communist ideas in countries so close to home. In 1962, the Soviet Union decided to put missiles in Cuba to threaten the United States. This started a tense period of 13 days to see if the Soviets would remove the missiles. In the end, the missiles were removed. The world had never been so close to an actual nuclear war. In Vietnam, a communist rebellion in 1954 began the Vietnam War. It was a long, violent war with both U.S. and Soviet involvement. The Vietnam War resulted in the deaths of many young Americans and sparked a cultural rebellion against war in the U.S. Many young people did not want to fight. While not communists themselves, the young Americans did not agree with the U.S. involvement in the war. The Vietnam War lasted until 1975, when the U.S. removed its last troops and Vietnam became a communist country. The space race. The Cold War was not only fought on Earth, but in space, too. Both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to conquer space. The Soviet Union started the race by sending Sputnik, the first satellite, into space to orbit Earth. The following year, in 1958, the Soviets sent Laika, the first dog, into space. By 1969, the U.S. succeeded in putting astronauts on the Moon. The space race was watched by the whole world. It was a way for both superpowers to show their superiority. The end. As time went by, the differences between the free world and the communist world were undeniable. Television and radio carried ideas across borders freely, conveying a truth that everyone could witness with their own eyes. During 1989 and 1990, Berlin again returned to the spotlight when the Berlin Wall came down and the border opened. Communism in Eastern Europe collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell. In reality, the decline of communism was a result of problems that the USSR had at home. But one question remains: will these two superpowers ever meet again in another Cold War?